I've always been fascinated by horror films and genre films. And horror films harbored a fascination for me and always have been something I've wanted to watch and wanted to make. I think that, back in the day, there used to be a lot of horror films that kind of had a checklist of what went into making the perfect horror film, and I think now people are raising the bar in the industry, as far as the types of horror films that are being made. Alien is one of my all-time favorite horror films, that has a great monster. I like the fact that major studios have been attempting horror films recently. People want a story, and my horror films have never been about only ghosts and spirits. They have their share of love, hatred, jealousy and complexity of relationships involved. Typically in horror films the character just services the plot, and you really are just going from point A to point B, just so that you can end up at point C. They are just sort of stick characters. That's just not interesting to me. I get startled really easily, so I hate horror films. I have to close my eyes when I think something is going to make me jump, because I just scream. I love watching horror films because I don't get scared easily. I don't try to sanction other people's joy in monsters. I mean, I think the fact is, humor, fantasy, like fear, desire or laughter, create genres of their own, comedy, melodrama, or erotic films or horror films. The boundaries cannot be defined. It's to each his own. With horror movies, a bigger budget is actually your enemy. You want to feel the rough edges, the handmade quality to good horror films. It's a genre that benefits from not having everything at your disposal. I don't like horror films. Horror films in the sense of the way horror films are now, like Saw. I don't like that, I don't. Not many people realize this, but I'm a really squeamish guy. When I watch other horror films that are really over the top with their blood and guts, I cannot watch it. In most horror films, you don't really get to understand why this character is the way he is. I always say horror films are great date movies. In the first 20 minutes, you're going to end up in each other's arms. No, the horror genre is not my first love. I don't run to the theater to see horror films. I think that horror films have a very direct relationship to the time in which they're made. The films that really strike a film with the public are very often reflecting something that everyone, consciously or unconsciously feeling, atomic age, post-9/11, post-Iraq War. It's hard to predict what people are going to be afraid of. Some people think that horror films are some sort of second-class filmmaking, and the only way to bypass that thinking is being proud of the fact that we do it. This is how I feel about horror films. There's enough scary things that happen in day-to-day life. Sometimes just going and getting the mail is scary, when you open your bills. And so, sometimes I feel like scary movies are just tapping into those anxieties and magnifying them. I'd love to continue my career in Hollywood. I'd love to do another action film, or a romantic comedy, or horror. I love horror films. When I was a little kid, I loved horror films. I always liked being scared. Strategically, horror films are a good way to start your career. You can get a lot of impact with very little. You need to be invested in what happens. The characters are your conduit to the story. Many modern horror films are fun but not frightening because one has not connected with the characters. I'm into The Walking Dead, Shaun of the Dead, obviously, and I've seen all the Romero movies. I am a classic zombie queen, and I love the White Walkers on Game of Thrones. Weirdly, it wasn't until pretty late in life that I found my entry point into horror films. I'm a big fan of horror films, particularly Friday the 13th. It's one of the only genres that weaves abstract experimental techniques into the mainstream. Having to be spooky requires a little more creativity. I think that the episodes are like mini horror films really. The characters make bad decisions early on and these things just snowball for them and get worse and worse. And that's what I find funny. As much as I like watching horror films, I never thought I would act in them. I always go with the story and character, and if those are good and if the setting is something that's scary, horror films seem to always take place at night and the weather's always bad, then I might be interested. I spent years working in low-budget horror films. When you've done Cannibal Women in the Avocado Jungle of Death, you can handle anything. In all the horror films that I have done, all of those women were strong women. I don't feel I ever played the victim, although I was always in jeopardy. People have always liked to be frightened. People love to feel that jolt of adrenaline. People love roller coasters. people love skydiving. These things that really get your heart pumping, and horror films are sort of a safe way to get that rush, I guess. As far as film goes, I enjoy all Hollywood films and all horror films like The Bride of Frankenstein, which also might be my favorite. I like 60s and 70s Italian and Spanish horror films. I've always loved, actually I didn't always love horror films. I started out and I only liked comedies and dramas. I think horror films in the past maybe touched on social themes having to do with whatever era in which they were made, but in the end, it's definitely an escapist form of entertainment. Great horror films don't win Academy Awards. One of my favorite horror films of the 90s was Event Horizon. I do know that I've read somewhere that it's been statistically proven that in times of war, horror films are much more popular. I don't know why that is. You'd think it'd be the opposite. You'd think people would want to escape from it. I'm not a person who's obsessed with scary movies or horror films or anything like that, so when I was watching the original, Walking Dead, I was kind of surprised at how into it I was getting. At this point in my career, it doesn't bother me much that I'm probably hopelessly typecast. I like to work, and horror films definitely keep me working. It's been said that horror films are experimental forms of art, and I agree. As an actress, you're put in positions and have to experience emotions that are way beyond reality, whether fighting in a post-apocalyptic world or being possessed by the devil. When I was a kid, I loved horror films. I used to stay up on Saturday night to watch. Poor decisions and bad luck are contingencies of most horror films. It's a very good time for horror. This business certainly has changed, but there's still room for serious horror films. Look at 28 Days Later. That's not a tongue-in-cheek picture. Horror films are the anchovies of the cinema. Either you like them, or you don't. I did love horror films from the 70s and 80s. That was my sweet spot. I think horror films always have to be as simple as possible. I mean, horror films in general put humans in these awful supernatural or horrible situations, but Cabin in the Woods cranks it up a few notches and becomes outrageous and totally bizarre. I don't think you need to spend $40 million to be creepy. The best horror films are the ones that are much less endowed. I think there's an instinct to make grotesque horror films that are purely carnal, like the Saw movies. I'm really easily affected by horror films. I have pretty strong reactions to them. All of us have our individual curses, something that we are uncomfortable with and something that we have to deal with, like me making horror films, perhaps. Visit our website for more quotes. Quoting.com